Gary Keller is a real estate agent in the United States, real estate agency. And it's the largest privately owned real estate agency in the entire United States. And he started from just him as a real estate agent, and now it's a multi-billion-dollar company. So obviously he knows something about success. He had a pivot in his life where he realized that most of the things that he was doing day to day were not really needle moving. They weren't really that useful. He was checking things off of his to-do list, and he felt busy and he felt like he was doing things. And even at the end of the day, sometimes he would be tired. He would do a lot of things. It's not like you're not doing something. You can be very busy and unproductive at the same time. And that's sort of what the one thing is all about. So a lot of people, they go through their lives and they're busy, but they're not really changing things. So how do we combine productivity and being busy? And the crazy thing is that once you become super productive and you're good at focusing on the right things, you actually have to work less, ironically. That's sort of the holy grail, if you will, right? At the end of the day, how can we move the needle more by not working as hard, by working smarter, not necessarily as hard? You know an Archimedes lever, where you have a lever and the fulcrum of the lever, this is like from physics class, that the fulcrum is right here and you're right here. If you give me a long enough lever, I can move the world. One of the tricks in life to be able to move the needle faster and also more efficiently and easier is to have the right Archimedes lever. And in this case, for our lives, oftentimes that's one word. The idea is time management. But what is time management? How do you manage your time correctly? What do you really have to do? What is something that you have to do in order to manage your time effectively? So you have to kind of choose your priorities. And then once you have your priorities, what do you have to do after? After you have a prioritized list, you're like, I know what to do. After you have your plan, what do you got to do? You can make a list. And then once you have your list, what do you do after that? When you're actually executing, what do you got to do? Put a time frame for each item. But what does the time frame force you to do? Remember Pomodoro technique, where you say, I'm only going to work on this for 5 minutes. I'm going to work on this for 30 minutes. I'm going to work on this for 1 hour. My wife does this all the time. There's sort of a deadline built in here. So while you're in there, what's the one thing that you got to do? Focus. So it's interesting that time management comes down to focus. Yeah, deep work is another level of focus. So part of deep work, we're kind of skipping ahead here, but this is good. Deep work is like the ultimate way of focusing. So you're completely undistracted, meaning no phones, no YouTube on the side, no new tabs. My job has to do with writing, and I will listen to music that doesn't have lyrics in it, because the words of the lyrics will distract me from the words that are coming from the universe, whoever's speaking through me whenever I'm writing. So I'll listen to classical music or electronic music that doesn't have any words, completely undistracted from even other sounds. And then you have to have a clear aim, a clear goal, right? Priorities, clear priority. Either it's to finish something or it's to work on something. So for example, you may have a creative problem that doesn't have an obvious solution. The way to get to that solution, the creative solution that you need, is sometimes to really focus on that problem. Like think of yourself like a professor or a scientist going on a walk, or having your journal and really journaling about this one idea or this one problem. If I wanted to start this business, what are the 10 things that I would have to do? Let your brain really focus on that for a while, right? Give yourself that quiet time. And then for deep work, what you also want to do is you want to get immediate feedback. So after you've worked, ask your supervisor, ask your manager, ask someone that you trust. And remember, choose your mentors wisely, right? So you don't want to necessarily learn from someone who just is in close proximity to you. Just because they're your friend or your family doesn't mean that they're an expert. Get feedback from someone you admire in that specific skill, because you may think, okay, Jonathan's, pretty decent at productivity and business, but I shouldn't be your basketball mentor. So make sure you demarcate who is good at what skill, right? So you get positive feedback. And by positive, I don't mean like they tell you good job. I mean, it's feedback that you can use, like useful feedback. And then you learn something. You say, oh, okay, all right. So now that I learned this, guess what's going to happen the next time you go through that? You're going to get a little bit better, or you're going to move the needle a little bit more of that idea. I do this all the time when I'm creating a course, for example. In one of my previous jobs, I took books and I made them into courses. One of the things that I had to do is I would read the book and then I would say, oh, well, am I going to make 10 ideas for this? Is it going to be 5 ideas? Is it going to be 15? Which are the big ideas? What am I going to teach? Because there's lots of stuff in a book, right? I would go into a deep work session here and I would come up with my first 10 ideas, my first 15 ideas. And then the next day I would come back to it and I would look at it with fresh eyes and with a fresh brain. And I would say, okay, how can I make this a little bit better, right? These ones are not exactly correct. Let me replace them with one better. And you do that 2 or 3 times and all of a sudden you're done. But what doesn't work is when you kind of ruminate. What do you guys think the difference between like a deep work focusing session is and rumination? You ever heard that word, rumination? On the surface, they look like the same thing, but they're very different. One is focused, right? You're like, I'm specifically have this priority. And then on my priority, I'm blocking out a time blocking, a specific goal, and then I have this time frame, and then I'm focusing in order to solve this problem. Now, for granted, you're not going to necessarily come up with the perfect solution right away, right? E equals MC squared wasn't, in Einstein's brain when he was, in his early 20s right away, right? It took an entire lifetime. You're not going to come up with the answer right away, but you got to focus, right? So we kind of have a map now, right? This is like how to manage your time. So we agree that the number one thing is to prioritize. And how do you think we should prioritize? What's the best way to prioritize? Based on what? Remember, I think I've drawn this before. Some people are saying urgency, and I do understand that idea. So prioritizing on a day-to-day basis based on the urgency of a deadline, or what we call sometimes a fire. You guys know what we mean when we say there's something on fire? The metaphor for that is you're going about your day, you're having dinner, maybe you watch a movie, you're going to go on a walk, you're going to do some exercising, and then your house is on fire. Are you in the middle of exercising and you say, no, it doesn't really matter. I don't care that my house is on fire. I'm going to keep exercising. The metaphor is like, you got to put out the fire right away, right? It's very, very important, right? So if you have any fires, of course, you got to put them out. But even that is you got to become better and better at discerning between what is a fire and what is something on your to-do list that you're convincing yourself is a fire because it's easier to do. Because to-do lists are often easier than the really important things because they're kind of muscle memory. You're used to them. You check. And everyone loves, checking off. I say like my happiest days are when I just have a really long checklist and I check off everything. I'm like, I feel so good. Like, yes, I crushed it, right? So that is, and you probably feel the same way. But oftentimes we can trick ourselves by having a to-do list that's really long, but nothing is really that important. That's kind of what our first point was. So yes, if you have a fire, definitely put out the fire. But generally speaking, when you prioritize, you say, is there a fire? If yes, put out the fire. Okay, totally. You notice that some of you said North Star and purpose. So that's like way up top. Or purpose, your North Star. Why are you here? These big existential philosophical questions, right? And then some of you said, what's urgent? And that's almost opposite, right? You're like, man, some of you were like, what's now? And some of you said, what I'm going to accomplish in 25 years and what's going to be on my tombstone and what people are going to remember me for. And the crazy thing is that you're both right. So if there's a fire, because there's not always a fire, right? So if there's a fire, then yes, put out the fire. But if there's not a fire, the way that you should think about your priorities are relative to your purpose, okay? And then draw them back, okay? So always be going towards your North Star. And then every single day, you're going to ask yourself this question. He calls this the focusing question. What could I do today that if I did it would make everything else in my life easier or unnecessary? And a lot of your stuff on your to-do list isn't that. Meaning, what is something that is a stepping stone for the next thing, right? If I check this off, is that going to move me closer to my goals? Or is this just something that I have to check off every single day, kind of on autopilot? And you'll notice that a lot of these big needle movers, like finish a chapter in my book, for example, these are difficult. These are way more difficult. They take more mental energy. And sometimes they're scarier because they require vulnerability and they require you to put something out there that isn't perfect. And you want it to be great because a lot of these have to do with your identity. This is like a piece of art or updating your resume or something like that. There's some stakes. The stakes are higher usually on the things that are most important and they're more difficult. So oftentimes you avoid these. And what he says, really, there's one thing that you should do every single day. There's one thing that you should do every single day that will move the needle in your life. If I just did this one thing, it would really move the needle. Now, a little bit more advanced version of this is there's one thing for different categories, right? So maybe there's a one thing for love. So maybe that's you and your spouse or your family. There's one thing for community. There's one thing for your physical health. There's one thing for your mental health. And then, of course, there's something for your career. But something that I like to do is ask myself, what is my one thing for these different categories, right? Because life is not just work. And you'll find that if you become more powerful at work, work will feel less like work. That'll happen over time if you're focused on the right thing. But what's your one thing? It could be as simple as like saying to your husband or your wife that you love them. For community, it could be having a text with your family, like a text group with your family, and making sure you're responding in that text group every single day a little bit instead of just going silent to keep those bonds close. For your health, maybe it's exercise. A little bit of exercise every single day. That'll move the needle. Also, maybe something that you could eat. Maybe there's something healthy that you can eat, maybe some kind of shake or some kind of vitamin. Or maybe it's something that you don't eat. Sometimes things are some things that you stop doing, like stop smoking. That would be a good one thing. Your mental health. Maybe that's going to a therapy session. Maybe that's being vulnerable with a friend. Maybe that's talking to your husband or your wife. Maybe that's meditating, getting a good night's sleep. Sleep is always on there. And then for your career, it's, changes slightly day to day. It changes quarter to quarter, it changes year to year. So for example, right now, we're launching another company called Virtual Courses now, which is going to do a lot of education. And so our big one thing is shooting videos. That's the big one thing. So if we plan about videos, if we think about the courses, if we think about the lessons, if we have meetings about the lessons, is that going to move the needle? Or do you think if we actually shoot the videos, get the product? So the one thing for me is shoot the videos. But listen, the truth is that there's not always just one thing, right? The one thing is it's a good idea, right? So it's a good thought experiment. What is the one thing that if I did that today, that would be the biggest needle mover in my life? So you have the one thing, and then you want to have something called the success list. Does anyone know what a success list is or remember what it is versus a to-do list? It's actually pretty simple. It's just the one thing is 1, the success list is 3, and the to-do list is, infinite. Success list is, the way I think about it, is your important KPIs, key performance indicators. The one thing is the most important, but if after I do the one thing, what are the next 3 most important things? And then you can do your to-do list. And the reason why is because I do this, everyone does this at times. You kind of trick yourself into being like hyper productive that day. Check. Have you ever done this? You have like 15 things on your plan list and you do 12 of them and you're like, oh man, I did 12 of them. But the 1 or 2 of them at the bottom here that you didn't do are like probably the most important. And the reason why you don't do them is because it's the hardest thing. It's usually something that you're not that good at yet. It's something that pushes the boundaries of your capabilities. It's something that maybe makes you vulnerable. It's something new. You're not used to it. It's something maybe big. Have you ever heard how do you eat an elephant? 1 bite at a time. So the idea is that your success list and your one thing are often big as well, right? So you know that you're not going to fully finish it today. Like writing a book or, creating a movie or finishing a song or finishing your business plan or coming up with a new system, using a new software for the company. There's no way you're going to be able to do that. That is the one thing, maybe. Maybe that's the one thing that's going to move the needle the most. But oftentimes these to-do lists are completely done, right? So if you check, and it's done. It's done. And then maybe the next day it happens again, but it's done. So you feel this sense of accomplishment. You feel a sense of completeness. You feel whole, if you will, right? You're like, yes, I like this. But these on your success list and the one thing are often more difficult. There's usually less of an obvious answer because easy things are easy. Easy doesn't really move the needle. But simultaneously, one thing that's holding us back as well is that oftentimes the one thing or your success list is ongoing, meaning that you have to eat a bite every single day for maybe years or a quarter or 6 months or a year. You don't get that immediate satisfaction of that win. You're not like, oh, I won today. I didn't check. I won. You're like, I kind of made progress. But there's nothing that I can say that I, completed. And in that sense, you're going to want to make this easier when you're prioritizing your goals and you say, okay, I want my one thing. And then you have your success list. And we know that we're going to do these first. We'll get to this in a second, the reason why. You want to, if your success list and your one thing is actually this big, right? And it's going to take 100 days to finish it. 100 little micro things. So okay, my one thing is, I want to shoot this course. Well, what do I have to do today? Define today. What is the one thing relative to the big one thing? What's the one thing that I have to do today? And then that will give you a little kind of a win, something to check off. Does that make sense? You kind of make it smaller. Define each bite. I know that I want to eat this elephant. Okay, that's my one thing. Great. So every single day, I'm going to make progress in eating this elephant. But today, I'm not going to worry about eating the elephant. I'm going to worry about eating the one toe. but you define which toe that you're going to eat. So you draw it back down to like, okay, what's the one thing that I have to do today? So now you're kind of like tricking your brain, right? Because you're getting a win. You're like, yeah, I finished that. I finished eating the left toe. So you feel good, but you're also not checking off a bunch of boxes that don't really matter. You're making progress towards the one thing. Does that make sense? It's kind of a tricky way to trick your brain into doing the one thing, even when it's hard. You guys understand this idea? Basically, it's because not everything that you do has the same impact, right? That's kind of the most important thing to understand here, right? It's like you can do a lot of things, but some things have more impact than other things. The reason why certain things impact more, have you ever heard of the domino effect? So we all know that, one domino leads to another domino. This is also kind of like the compound effect, right? But the domino effect is a little bit different because do you know how much bigger one domino can be from the previous domino? And it'll still topple over. Then I have a domino this big. And then I have a domino this big. And I hit it, it'll actually go over still, right? So then there's even bigger one. And then that one goes over. So we can start with a small domino. I think it's something crazy. Like you start with like a 3 centimeter domino, and then that can actually knock off a domino that's 3.75, right? And that one can knock off one that's 5 inches or 5 centimeters. And then that one can be 7.5. And they get bigger and bigger and bigger. Something crazy, like after 50 dominoes, you're to the moon, right? So it gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger very fast. It's pretty crazy. That's the benefit of the one thing. It may not feel that big in the beginning, but if you're constantly knocking off one that's bigger, eventually your power and the impact that you make will be huge. How do we do this? Is really chunking your day. Okay, chunking your day is how you create like balance in your life, right? So sometimes people are like, "Oh, I'm working all the time," or "I never have time for this," or "I never have time for this," right? You know what the first thing that you should do whenever you're planning your day, or whenever you're planning your week? What's the first priority that you should plan? If you're chunking time, you're gonna like, okay, these 3 hours, I'm gonna do this. These 5 hours, I'm gonna do this. These 10 hours, I'm gonna do this. On Wednesday, I'm gonna do this, right? Let's say you have this like perfect calendar plan, right? You're gonna chunk time blocks, time for yourself. So you remember we had different categories of the one thing, like love, we had community, we had mental health, physical health, and then we had career. So the first 4 that we talked about, this time for yourself, this is actually more important than anything else. Because if you're unstable in other parts of your life, it's very difficult to perform well at work. And you just want to be a well-rounded person. So the first thing that you do, the first time that you chunk, and you have to be able to say no. That's like one of the most important things, is you have to be able to say no. Saying yes means saying no. So you're going to have a lot of people, a lot of friends, a lot of whatever, a lot of people, like you're going to feel pressure. You got to be able to say no. This is what my priority is. This is my one thing. This is my trajectory. This is where I'm going. This is where I want to go. I'm on that path and I've chunked my time off and I'm going to do my one thing on this time every single day. And then I'm going to do my success list and I'm going to do my meetings and I'm going to do my to-do list and I'm going to have my KPIs. And then you know what? I'm going to take a bath. I'm going to go on a walk with my significant other. I'm going to have my morning coffee. You got to demarcate those times and really protect them, protect that time. But in order to protect them, you're going to have a lot of people from the outside world that are going to like talking to you and, oh, you should do this and you should do that and you should do this and you should do this. I haven't necessarily defined what your one thing is, have I? I didn't tell you what your success list is. I didn't say you should always do this. I said, it's for you. You decide. This is like the meta way of approaching life, right? So time for yourself is the number one thing. Then the second thing is your one thing. And the crazy thing is, if you did just this every single day, your life would be a lot better. You line up someone that did 50 to-do list things and someone that did their one thing. They were very focused. Over time, because this will move the domino and the to-do list doesn't move the domino, they'll actually make more progress. Kind of crazy. And then the next thing that you want to do is you always want to be planning. This is the most important. So you always kind of know what your one thing is in a way, because the one thing usually takes more time. But every day you should chunk time to organize your day. That's very meta. You're like, I need to chunk time in order to know how to chunk time correctly in the future. That's really important. And this also creates balance in your life, because if you do this correctly, then you know what time you have off. And also, this is the final point. What is like one of the biggest problems that you guys have whenever you have like a list of things that you want to do? Like, I want to exercise, I want to meditate, I want to read the book, I want to go to my meetings, I want to do my one thing, I want to do my success list, motivation. The answer for motivation is why, is purpose. So if you feel unmotivated, it's usually you want to focus on like giving to others. You want to be like a hero So if you're a hero, you often feel motivated, right? If you're doing something for someone else, you feel motivated. Always try to remind yourself of your big why. Pressure is focusing on the outcome usually instead of the process, right? So you're feeling pressure from who? Feeling pressure from society, from your bosses, from your client or partner. You're feeling pressure, but oftentimes that's because you're focusing on the momentary feedback that you're getting rather than the big picture. The goal should be to make small progress. Define what the left toe is, right? That kind of helps that. Procrastination is planning. If you have, your day is organized and you know that I'm going to do this in this order, then you cut off the option of doing anything else. It's like this time you're doing that thing. Like there is no option. You don't give yourself the option of saying no. And a lot of this is making like your environment, creating a positive environment, right? So if you're like, I know I should be writing this thing, but I sat down to do it, but I didn't, have my computer ready. Or I sat down to do it, but I had my phone out and my YouTube started. I started getting pinged from Snapchat or something, right? Well, then put your phone in another room. If you know that you're going to need a list of certain things, then maybe right before this, 10 minutes before, is gathering that kind of stuff. It ends up becoming a little robotic, but there's this really cool idea called discipline equals freedom. So the more disciplined you are, the more freedom of thought you have, the more freedom of like actually mental health you have, and also the more freedom that you'll eventually have. Because if you're disciplined, and a lot of people aren't, then eventually you'll end up making more money, and more money leads to freedom. There's a guy named Cal Newport, and he says that the number one thing that differentiates people monetarily nowadays in like the modern economy is discipline and focus. So some people are able to like focus for 3 to 5 hours and actually work really hard. And some people are just distracted. It's normal, but normal is average and average is not extraordinary. So if you want to live an extraordinary life and you're doing things that everyone is doing, then what's what you're going to get? There's something else that is self-expectations. Yeah. Self-expectations. I think that's similar to pressure, right? It's like self-pressure in a way. I think that's like setting maybe too high of expectations. I would say defining success based on practice or process. Right. So today, my goal is to practice the one thing. Like for a writer, I'm going to write 1,000 words. I didn't say write perfect 1,000 words that is the best 1,000 words ever. Just write 1,000 words. So I would say if you're putting a lot of pressure on yourself, then remind yourself that there is no like I'm already good enough or I'm great or I'm going to be perfect or that sort of thing. Right. There's only improvement. It's only practice. Like LeBron James still practices. LeBron James probably practices more than all of us. So the thing that LeBron James is the best in the world at, he practices more than all of us. Is that an accident or is that a cause, right? This is like a trick question. What do you do after you become a master? You just become a student again, right? The never ending process. So I would say, like lower the stakes a little bit. Generally speaking, you're going to want to try to win your KPIs, right? That makes sense. But also know that the way that you really improve is by pushing the boundaries. And by pushing the boundaries, you're necessarily going to fail. And if you don't want to fail and that's defining your self-worth, that's really tough. So whenever we say things like, oh, you got to crush today, and like we're going to the moon and we're going to be amazing, like we're not saying outcome. We're saying process, right? If one of your check marks is do something that scares me and fail really bad at it, that's great to put on your to-do list. If you check this box every day, you will improve faster than if you check off your to-do list. Do something that really scares me and publicly fail. Do you see how you redefine success there? Success is now failing. That's weird. But it's not like an existential failing. It's like a micro, because whenever you're practicing, you're always failing a little bit. You got to flip it on its head. I would say with external, sometimes this is tough if you have like certain family members, but external often is your inner circle. This is going to be tough to say, but if you're noticing patterns, ask yourself, is this like a one-off? Is this like a weird emergency? Or is this something that happens a lot? Is like this person often distracting? Is this person always a victim? And if that person is constantly a victim, then you might want to cut them out of your inner circle. And even if it's your family, like this is your life. If you have a purpose and someone else is like holding you back from that purpose, then in a way, they're kind of like a devil, for your living into your fullest potential, right? We want to unlock your fullest potential. And if we have people that are like demons holding you back because they can't unlock their own fullest potential, then sometimes you got to cut them out. If it's a distraction like social media or something like that, then that's very controllable. And then you just have to take ownership over it and say like, I'm going to do it, which in that case is usually putting it away. But generally speaking, the best way to approach life is just to have extreme ownership. This is maybe a very American idea, but I think nowadays it can be a global idea because of the internet, where it's like you can accomplish anything you want if you just put your mind to it. You can learn anything you want. Even the idea of focusing on outside distractions versus what I can control, that's the first problem. How can I control this? Can I control even my perception of this thing that's happening? The classic one is like if you're in like really big traffic, like you're in long traffic. Whenever I'm in a traffic jam, like I lived in Los Angeles, it was terrible traffic. I would actually think it was like a sign from God that I was supposed to learn something that I was listening to in an audiobook. Because I've never listened to music or anything like that while I'm driving. So I'm always listening to an audiobook. And so if there was like an unexpected traffic, I would think of that as a gift. I'd be like, wow, I have an opportunity to learn more from this book. You see how in one sense you're like, oh, it was an outside distraction. The outside world was out to get me. I was unlucky. I can't believe that happened to me. This always happens to me. The government is bad. The world is bad. My family's bad. Other people have a better advantage than me, right? It's like, yeah, sure. You can think about the world that way, or you can think about the world as you're grateful for everything you have, and you can think of every obstacle as an opportunity to learn. Kind of like mindset shift a little bit. You notice we're doing a lot of jujitsu here. We're shifting like negative things and making them positive. That's kind of like one of the keys of successful people.